This morning, we are in our fifth session looking at the Song of Solomon. And last time that we talked specifically about Song of Solomon was when we were out at the campground. And we took a look at the first 4 chapters. And so that's where I'm picking up today again, is to continue giving you an overview of the storyline of this book of the Bible, this greatest song as it describes itself. There's a few things I want to highlight as we move towards the section that I want to specifically get to today. If you remember, in the beginning of chapter 4, we looked at this at the end of our time at the campground. It says in verse 1, "Behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair." And this is the Lord calling out things that he sees in the bride. Remember, what's happened in the storyline so far is that she has been awakened in her love. She met Jesus, who gave her salvation, gave her forgiveness, and she talks about sitting under the shade of the tree, and she's enjoying the shade, his protection over her life. And she talks about the banqueting house and the banner of love that is over her, and she's enjoying the presence of the Lord, until suddenly she sees the king coming, and he's like a gazelle leaping over the mountains. And he comes to her in a way that she hasn't seen him before, and her heart starts being afraid. And she's like, what is he doing? Why is he coming like this? And he comes and he speaks to her and he says, "Rise up, my love. Come away with me." And she has this fear response of, no, it's good for me to sit under the shade of the tree. It's good for me to be under his banner of love and to be at the banqueting table with him. And now he's calling me to go to the mountains. And specifically, Jesus talks about the mountain of Myrrh, which is where death takes place, death of self. And so she is having a battle within herself. She's like, no, you turn away, she says, and go your way. I'm not ready for that kind of commitment. And so the next thing she experiences is the presence of her beloved being removed because she is under discipline. But she sets her heart and she says, okay, I want you. I need your presence. I want you to come back to me. And so she sets her heart to go to the mountain. And that's kind of where we're picking up today. So the prophetic heart of the bridegroom God is the header section here. And what is happening here is as our heart responds to Jesus, when he calls us to go to the mountain with him, when we have a heart that responds, he starts calling forth things that he sees in us, even though they haven't yet happened. But our heart is prepared. In Romans 4 verse 17, it says this, "God calls those things which do not exist as though they did." See, God sees the potential. If you remember, we talked about Gideon at the end of our service at the campground. And I reminded you of that story where Gideon is hiding in the threshing floor, and he's hiding because of fear of the enemy that keeps on coming and plundering the land. And he's throwing the wheat up. He's trying to separate the chaff from the wheat, and he can't do it effectively in the location that he's in because he's hiding, and there's no wind to carry that chaff away where he is. And so we have this story of Gideon where the angel comes and he speaks to Gideon and he says, "You are a mighty man of valor." And Gideon's looking at himself. He's like, "I'm hiding. I'm in the valley where I cannot accomplish the thing I'm trying to do. I'm fearful. How can you say that I'm a mighty man of valor?" Well, Romans 4:17 says God calls forth those things that aren't yet. but he sees those. And so with the bride in this storyline, she has experienced the discipline of the Lord by him removing his tangible presence. Now you need to understand there's a difference between his presence, because he promises to never leave nor forsake us, and the difference between feeling his presence. We need to understand that, because truth is that he has never left us and will never leave us. But our experience is that sometimes we feel as though he has left us. In those moments, we need to examine our heart. We need to see, okay, am I being disciplined for disobedience? Am I doing something that he's called me to do, but I've refused to do? Because in those instances, the Lord will use his discipline to get us back on track because of his love for us. And so she experiences that, and she doesn't want to miss his presence. So she sets her heart to go towards the mountain, which is what he called her to do. She hasn't yet gone. But here in verse 1, because of the prophetic heart, because the bridegroom God sees the things that aren't yet, but calls them forth, he says to them, you are fair, my love. You are fair. You're beautiful to me. You've set your heart towards obeying me and to following me and to going towards it. And I love you for that. Initially, she had refused, in paragraph B, to obey his call to come to that mountain. But she says in verse 6, I will go my way to the mountain of myrrh. And there's a recognition there. See, myrrh, if you remember, we talked about this. Myrrh is an embalming spice that covers over the smell of death. And in fact, myrrh was used when Jesus died on the cross. He was embalmed. The women brought spices, if you remember. And now he didn't need them because he rose again after 3 days, right? His body did not see decay. But myrrh is a picture all throughout Scripture of death. And we need to understand, the wise men, they came with gifts, and one of them was myrrh. And it was because of the destiny of Jesus of coming to die for our sin. And so the mountain of myrrh, when the bride makes her choice to go there, she is declaring, I'm going to go on my way to the mountain where self is going to die. And I recognize this, and the reason I'm going there is because my King is calling forth things in me that he sees. At this point in the song, she hasn't yet made it to the mountain, but she has set her heart to do that. What is it that the Lord has called you to do that you need to set your heart towards doing? Some of us have experienced the discipline of the Lord, and we forget that we need to look at what was the starting point of that discipline. Why am I living under the correction of the Lord constantly? What is it I need to go back to set my heart to do that he called me to do? And only you can answer that question. See, the bridegroom, he has a ravished heart. In verse 9, you have ravished my heart, my spouse, with one look of your eyes. See, when we lock gaze with the Lord, we set our gaze to look at his gaze. We receive everything we need for that time. He imparts his love, his affection for us, his ravished heart. He declares here, when you look at me, my heart beats faster. When you look at me, my heart is yearning for more of this connection with you. This is a high point in the song. There are several of them. But she has said in her heart, she will go to the mountain. She hasn't done it yet. But he says, because you set your heart to do this, my heart is ravished for you. You are fair, my love. In verses 12 through 15, Jesus actually gives a sevenfold description of her purity. And remember, she's going to the mountain where self is going to die. And he gives this description, calling these things out as he sees them. He sees the finished work in her already. And an amazing thing happens here. A garden enclosed is my sister. He's declaring this over her, my spouse. A spring shut up, a fountain sealed. Now remember, this is describing the king's garden. One of the 7 wonders of the world, you may have heard of this before, it was the Hanging Gardens in Babylon, right? These were the king's gardens. It was beautiful, and they were enclosed. They were for the king's eyes. They were for him to enjoy. And so in those times, in Bible times, the garden of the king was a private place that he cultivated and that he enjoyed, where he spent time for himself. And so he calls forth in her, he says, you've set your heart to obey me. Your heart garden, your garden is becoming enclosed. It's becoming mine. You're a fountain that is sealed for me. A spring that is shut up for my pleasure. And then she does an amazing thing in verse 16. She calls forth the testing and the blessing of the Lord. She says, awake, O north wind, and come, O south. Blow upon my garden, that its spices may flow out. Let my beloved come to his garden and eat its pleasant fruits. This is the turning point in the Song of Solomon. The first 4 chapters are the bride's focus on her inheritance in Jesus. She is looking at everything that Jesus is giving to her. But here there's a turning point in the song where her focus changes, the paradigm changes, the worldview changes, where she has a recognition, I belong to Jesus and I am his inheritance. If we live with that view in sight, that the Lord has an inheritance in us, that changes everything. It changes our life's priorities. If I have the view of everything I do belongs to Jesus, everything I place in my life belongs to Jesus. If we have that view, then we become very intentional and very careful as to what we allow into our life. Because we are to be a garden that is enclosed. And she calls forth the north wind. Now, some of us today, physically outside, would like a north wind, right? What does the north wind do? It brings cool air, right? Now, however, in the winter, when the north wind comes, do we like it? No, we don't, right? Because it freezes our bones. See, the north wind in Scripture is the wind of testing. The wind of testing. And the south wind is the wind of blessing. And here's what she is saying. She is saying, Lord, I want you to awaken the winds of testing in my life, as well as the winds of blessing in my life. Because she recognizes she's going to the mountain of myrrh. She's going where she herself has to die. Her desires, her wishes, her focus needs to die. Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. This is where she's heading. She realizes in order to accomplish the purpose of death to self, I need that wind of testing to come, to purge things that need to be removed. But Lord, because of your goodness, would you also send blessing along with it? She says here, as the north wind and the south wind, as they come, I want them to blow on my garden that its spices may flow out. The spices are things that are fragrant. The fragrance of our life. I've used this analogy before. How do you smell to other people? And I'm not just talking physically, do you stink and need deodorant? I'm talking about how is the fragrance of your life. When people look at you, do they see a life that is being lived with purpose, with love, with a desire for more of what God has? Or when they look at you, do they see a life that is being completely wasted on the things of the world? We need to have a heart that recognizes we are a garden enclosed. And so we call upon the wind of testing and the wind of blessing to come and to make our life fragrant for the Lord. And then she has another major turn here in the song. She says, let my beloved come to his garden. See, it's no longer her garden. The garden of her life at this point in the song belongs to the beloved. That's the point that we need to embrace who God has designed us to be. And that is being made more and more into his image day by day. She says, let my beloved come to his garden and eat its pleasant fruits. It's interesting the way the Lord works. Because pleasant fruit that the Lord desires, comes through the winds of testing and blessing. So in the natural, we want to run away when there's difficult times. But what does the Lord want to accomplish in those difficult times? He wants to produce a fragrance in our life. It's interesting how the Lord has used my family in recent years. We've gone through a lot of times of testing, and I've always asked the Lord, God, why are you allowing this? Why is this happening? And the answer has always been, I'm preparing you to be able to minister to others that are going to go through that. You know, it's interesting to me that my dad passed away at the beginning of this year. How many people have lost their mother or their father in our congregation since then? You know, I would not have the same heart of compassion had I not just lost my father. And so I'm able to share my experiences with those that have lost loved ones. The Lord does things in our life, allows things in our life, even though they are testing, to produce a fragrance of how we are to live for him as his garden. Paragraph D, she wants the king to have his inheritance in her. And thus she prays this, let my beloved come to his garden. And then in chapter 5, verse 1, we have Jesus taking over here, and he says, I have come to my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. There's a recognition that he sees she is handing over the rulership of her life. You know, part of becoming a believer in Jesus Christ is to allow him to be Lord of our life. I believe lordship is a process because we set our heart towards lordship, but when we're starting off, there's so much of ourself still reigning in our life. We have to learn how to give that over to him and to have him go into the hidden places in our life and open those doors. You know, there's that great example of Jesus comes and knocks on your house, and you knew he was coming, and so you cleaned up the living room, and you thought he was going to just come into the living room and sit down, have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and he walks past the living room, goes into the kitchen, and you're like, oh, I'm so glad I did the dishes. But he walks through the kitchen, and he goes to the closet, and the closet is where you've thrown everything that was in the living room. And you just stuck it in there, and he goes straight for that closet, and he opens that door, and he says, this is mine too. What things do you have in your life that you've just piled into a closet trying to hide it from the Lord? And that's exactly where he's heading for. And you know it. The winds of testing are hand in hand with the winds of blessing. And when we call upon him to make our life his garden, he will take possession of it. He wants to take possession of our life. I want you to come with me to the cross. I want you to embrace the cross, because as you work towards the mountain of myrrh, the mountain of death, you need to embrace the cross of Christ, because that's where death takes place. And so the voice of the beloved comes to her. He knocks on her door and he says, "Open for me, my love, my perfect one. For my head is covered with dew, my locks with the drops of the night." Essentially, he's asking her a question here. He's saying, are you sure you want the north winds? Are you sure you want the winds of testing to come and to blow upon your garden and produce its spices, to make your life fragrant in this way? Are you sure that you are now my garden? Are you sure? What the Lord wants to do here is he wants to prove himself to us. I said at the beginning of this that he has promised his presence. That is a non-negotiable in the heart of God. But we don't always feel that way. In the times where we don't feel like the Lord is near, we need to embrace the promise of his nearness. Right? We need to embrace that promise. We need to speak truth to us. There is never a moment where the Lord is not paying attention to you. There's a preacher on the radio that years ago I heard a sermon. I think it was Charles Stanley, but it may have been Chuck Swindoll, so I don't remember who it was. But he said this, and I really love this analogy. He says, God never comes to the point where he says, I didn't know that. Right? Never once has God had that type of experience. He knows everything there is to know, and he knows it before it happens. So as you go through the wind of testing, you call for that wind of testing. You're like, Lord, I want more of you. I want to go with you. I want to be obedient. I understand this is taking me to the mountain where myself is going to die. I understand that. But I want you to speak your truth into my life, to produce your fragrance in my life, and to take me where I need to go. So yes, Lord, if I need to go to the cross with you, then that's what I want. It says in verse 4, chapter 5, my heart yearned for him. She hears his voice. Her heart yearns for him. I arose to open for my beloved. My hands dripped with myrrh on the handles of the lock. She's really set her heart towards going to the mountain of myrrh. She is dripping with myrrh. She rises up. She says, I will meet you in the dew of the night. And here there's an interesting thing that happens. In verse 6, it says, I opened for my beloved, but my beloved had turned away and was gone. My heart leaped up when he spoke. I sought him, but I could not find him. He gave me no answer. Have you ever been at a place where your relationship with the Lord is really strong? And you're praying and you're interceding for things and you're asking him to do things and you know you're praying in concordance with his will, but you just feel like you can't hear him. You feel like he's not answering you. Well, see, there's two times in the song where the Lord removes his tangible presence, the feeling of his presence. And this is the second time. He calls her. If you're really ready, if you're going to give your heart over so that it's my garden, if you're going to allow me to produce my fragrance, you need to come with me to the cross. He withholds his presence here in a test. She arises. She experiences this first test as God withdraws his presence. Again, he never withdraws in the true sense, but that discernible feeling of his presence was lessened or weakened. She says, I opened, but my beloved had turned away. I want you to understand this is not a discipline of the Lord. This is a testing of the faith. I've mentioned to you before that those who live under persecution they experience a testing of their faith that solidifies who they are in the Lord. If you talk to the persecuted church, yes, they want you to pray for them. They want you to intercede for their protection. But as they undergo persecution, in whatever form that takes, they recognize the Lord doing a work in their heart that brings forth the fruit of the Spirit. Some of you received a prayer text or email this week from me, from some family friends that just went under some severe persecution where the husband was killed by ISIS. And you know, when things like that happen, we wonder, Lord, why did you let that happen? What is your purpose in this? How are you going to bring about good? It's in those moments we have to apply what the Word says. We have to understand that the Lord has purposes to accomplish. My dad, he always quoted to me, I don't know if it was his favorite verse, but it was the one he quoted the most. It was Romans 8:28. For all things work together for good to those who are the called of the Lord, that are chosen according to His purpose. All things work together for good. So how does that work when we experience persecution, when things are going wrong, and we've searched our heart, we're like, God, I just don't get it. I really want a heart after you, and I'm trying, I can't find an area that I'm being disobedient to you, Lord, so why aren't things going great? Why is that? And the Lord speaks to your heart and He says, you need to trust me. See, our life here on earth is going to have severe challenges at times. But it's how the people of God respond to the God of love that makes the difference. The world is going to look at us and see how we deal with disaster. And they're going to make a choice based on how we respond. They're either going to say, I really want what those people have. And we have many stories of tragedies that have taken place, but then the church has responded in such an amazing, loving way. People have been drawn to that. But the other response is to react like the world does. See, if you recognize that Scripture is true and it says that God is going to accomplish His purposes, even if we don't see what they are, and He has all good things in mind when He allows things to happen to us that seem as though they are not good. And obviously we would say some of those things are just not good, but we need to hold on to that promise that God can make it good. He can accomplish His purposes. So as we go after Him, as we open to Him when He calls us to come to the cross, He will test our faith. In fact, there's a second test that takes place here. I've experienced this numerous times in various churches that the Lord has allowed me to minister to, whereas I've been pursuing Him and been trying to really get closer and closer with Him, the people have rejected what the Lord has been leading to do. And this is what happens in verse 7. The watchmen, the ones who are to be watching out, the prayer warriors, the ones who are supposed to be looking and guarding the church, the watchmen, they struck me, they wounded me. The keepers of the wall took my veil, which is speaking of that spiritual covering, and they took it away from me. This second test is that her ministry is rejected by men. The watchmen, the elders in the church, they struck me, they wounded me. The leaders of the city, the leaders of the kingdom, they took my veil, that covering away. I've lost my place. All the leaders are now against me. The presence of God has seemingly lifted from me. Now the leaders are against me. Have you ever Googled yourself? I Google myself regularly because I want to make sure that people aren't saying bad things about me, right? I've had it numerous times, and it's kind of funny because, you know, I'll talk to other churches in different situations, and they'll ask me about situations I've been a part of and want to know what the outcome was. And I say, well, it really depends on who you talk to, because there are plenty of people out there that don't like me. And they don't like me because of what the Lord was doing, and He was confronting their sin. And so when sin gets confronted, we have two options. Either embrace the cross, go to the mountain of myrrh, or keep your garden for yourself. Jesus called her to join Him in Gethsemane. He then allowed her to be tested in both ways related to her life vision. I don't know if you've caught that. Psalm 1 verse 4 is her life vision. We're going to spend some time on that next week. She says, draw me away, which is asking for that intimacy. And then she's saying, we will run after you, and it's that running together in ministry. See, her vision for her life is twofold. I want your presence to be felt in my life, and I want to be successful in the things that you ask me to do. And this is where the Lord tests her. He says, well, it's going to take me taking over your life. It's going to take you letting me be Lord. It's going to take you saying, your garden now belongs to me. It's going to take you saying, call upon the wind of the north, that wind of testing, and the wind of blessing from the south. It's going to take you to say, I want those fragrances to come out. So He tests her. This is a great part in the song, in verse 8, where she declares her intent once again. She says, "O daughters of Jerusalem," because she hasn't yet been able to regain that tangible presence of the Lord. She says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, tell him I am lovesick." Her response is, she is resolved. She is walking in maturity. She's like, you know what? I know the best thing for my life is to follow Jesus to the cross, to let myself die completely, to open that closet to Him freely and say, take everything out of here, put it all in place, or kick it out of my house. Lord, you be in charge. And she is saying, I'm lovesick for my beloved. She's not offended by what He's asking her to do. And the women, they respond, the daughters of Jerusalem, they respond and say, what is your beloved more than any other beloved, O fairest among women? They're saying, I don't get it. He has just allowed you to be struck by the watchman. He's just allowed you to lose your veil, to lose your ministry. He's just allowed you to not be able to find Him. How is it that He is your beloved? How is this? And she's like, oh, let me tell you about my beloved. She goes into this amazing description of the beauty of the beloved. And I get this, her revelation of Him is all based upon her decision to follow Him in obedience. See, when we set our heart towards follow Jesus no matter where He's going to take us, when we say, Lord, I'm yours, I'm going to do this, I'm not just going to sing the song, I'm going to do this. When we set our heart towards doing that, that's when He reveals Himself to us. And here's what she says, my beloved is white or dazzling, and chief among 10,000. His head is like finest gold, his locks are wavy, his eyes are like doves, his cheeks are like a bed of spices, his lips are lilies, his hands are rods of gold, his body is carved ivory, his legs are pillars of marble, his countenance is like Lebanon, his mouth is most sweet. Yes, he is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend. These are fantastic truths that are revealed to her in this time where she has set her heart towards following her beloved to the mountain of myrrh. She's essentially declaring to all those around here, I don't care what you think about me. I'm going after Jesus. You know, here's a good rule of thumb. When people come to you and say to you, why do you spend all your time with the Bible, with prayer, with people at church? Why do you do that? Don't you know there's other things to do? And here's what your response should be. If I thought that your vote counted when Jesus comes again, I will listen to you. But your vote doesn't count. Jesus' vote counts. He said, if I confess Jesus, then he will confess my name before the Father. How awesome is that? There is no greater thing than for Jesus to speak your name before the Father because you have honored him with your life. But I can guarantee you there will be plenty of people within the church, as well as outside, that will look at you and will say, why are you doing this? Why are you going so hard after Jesus? Don't you know that you can just get by doing a few things? Why do you have to give your whole life to him? I've had this many, many times. People coming to me say, why do you train your children the way that you do? Why don't you send them to public school? Why don't you allow them to have cell phones? Why don't you let them spend hours and hours on the internet? Why don't you do this and do this and do this? And I'm like, because my garden is no longer my garden. It belongs to him. I am his garden. And I have experienced that going where he leads is the safest place to be, even if it's the mountain of death. Even if it's the mountain of death. Jesus praises her after this season of testing. The king breaks his silence. He lavishes his affection on her. He describes her beauty. He says, "Oh, my love, you are as beautiful as Tirzah," which was a city in the northern part of Israel, "and as lovely as Jerusalem. You're awesome as an army with banners." An army of banners was a description in those times of an army that was victorious. They went into battle, and when they came back to their hometown, they would carry banners, and they would drag their prisoners in with them as well. But an army with banners is speaking of that victory that you have when you set your heart towards following the Lord. She defeats her greatest enemies. You know, our greatest enemies are those that are in our heart. I don't know if you've realized that. But there's a battle that goes on inside of you. Because you're hearing the things I'm saying, but you're also realizing this means there is a change necessary that only I can make. So there's a battle that goes on inside of you, and you're like, man, okay, if I need to set my heart to follow Jesus, then that means I need to start letting him remove things out of my life that are hindering him from working. A lot of people say that they don't want to come to faith because they know it means their life has to change. See, the problem is, it's true, your life will have to change. But what they don't understand is that you will want your life to change. Because as your heart becomes his garden, you start realizing, wow, I smell good. Wow, the spices that he is producing in my life, I had no idea they could come out of my garden. How has the Lord been using you in the last few months? I've seen a lot of you. There is fragrance coming out that is beautiful. Don't give up. Press in. Keep going hard after him. You know, it's summer now, right? Summer is when everybody wants to take a vacation. Do not take a vacation from God. Do not take a vacation from God. Ask him to pour into you in greater measure so that you would be able to withstand the pressures that are going to come on your life because you're pursuing him. An amazing verse Verse 5 in chapter 6, it says, turn your eyes away from me. It says, Jesus speaking to the bride, turn your eyes away from me. They have overcome me. Think of this for a minute. Jesus is saying, there is nothing that can conquer me, but when my bride looks at me with her eyes, I'm overcome. You've conquered my heart when you look at me, is what Jesus is saying. Paragraph C, we see her preeminence in the king's court. The attendants around his heavenly court are the seraphim, the cherubim, angels without number. And the bride's beauty is described. And in this verse, in this passage here, verses 8 to 10, it's picturing that throne room scene where it says there are 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. Who is she who looks forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, awesome as an army with banners? It's amazing the love that God has for us and his desire for us to be used by him in such an amazing way. Our destiny to rule and to reign with him. Again, there are those who will persecute the bride, as well as those who will receive her with sincerity. Return, return, O Shulamite, verse 13. Return, return, that we may look upon you. What would you see in the Shulamite, as it were? The dance of the two camps. See, there's a hostile response from some, but there's also a sincere response from others. Our position in God is not threatened by what people think about us. As we pursue Jesus with everything we have to give, Jesus is our reward.